it's different. I mean, one thing we do learn from all of this data is that we call it the international buyer market. We can slice and dice it so many ways. It's such a long tail. So we've had to limit some of our reports to the top 50 language and country combinations because it goes on for hundreds and hundreds of combinations of buyers. And in each one of those cases, there's a macroeconomic driver that affects their behavior.
I'm with Martin Dahl, who is the founder of international property portal Kiero, the leading international property portal for Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Italian properties. That sound about right?
Yeah, thanks. For the international buyer market specifically.
Of course. And the reason I wanted to chat to you is that you have just published the annual international buyer market report for Spain. And it's the first one of this type, isn't it?
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time and money trying to get our data infrastructure right. And this is the first report that's leveraging all of that time and investment in getting the nuts and bolts in the right place.
And just for context, the relevance to agents of this sort of information is that the portal specializes in an international buyer market. So there's not that much data that's sort of messy to do with the domestic property market, which is quite a different one to the international buyer market for Spain. So this is quite unique in that sense.
Yeah, I think so. It's part of the frustration that we have that when we look at government data in Spain, it's of course heavily skewed to the domestic market, but international buyers behave incredibly differently. I've got some interesting data points around that. Even international buyers from Latin America who speak Spanish behave very different from domestic Spanish-speaking buyers in Spain.
Okay. And then for more context, and so in Spain, roughly, I don't know, between 13 and 15%, depending on the year, of purchases of the 600,000 purchases are made by foreign buyers. And in the areas where the Mediterranean coastline, as well as the islands, those percentages can shoot up to like 30, 40%, almost like in the case of Mallorca. So it's, even though it might sound like not that relevant, 10, 15% of the total, in the areas that the agents who sell to international buyers are, it's probably in many cases 80, 90% of who they sell to.
Yeah, definitely. Sense. And the whole transaction is very different. So we know from surveys that in excess of 80% of international buyers don't get a mortgage. They have cash. So that really changes the shape of the transaction and how smoothly a transaction can go through. On the other hand, they're not driven by a new job, a bigger family. They're driven by aspirational things. So the transaction time frame can be really extended. It's not uncommon for an international buyer to send an inquiry today and to do a transaction in 2 years' time.
Right, gotcha. So, and am I also right in saying that what we look at in terms of the Spanish media to do with real estate tends to be focused, because it's mostly domestic, to the Spanish economy, Spanish employment situations, all the good stuff that's happening in Spain, good or bad. But in the case of the international buyer market, because they're coming from other countries, what is more relevant almost to those buyers is to those agents, is what is happening in Sweden, what's happening in the UK, what's happening in France. So it's a little bit more complicated than just kind of taking what the national news might tell you and see that as a trend or an indicator of how engaged and how interested the buyers are than maybe what you might see by reading the Spanish press. That makes sense?
Yeah, totally. And of course, by necessity, by the numbers, the domestic buyers are going to be centered around the big cities. They're heavily dominated by what's going on in Madrid, what's going on in Barcelona, but very few international buyers buy in those locations. They're buying along the coasts and on the islands. So it's a completely different market within a market.
I gotcha. Okay, so let's get to it. Then what takeaways have you got from this market report that you just released? Can you tell me some little tidbits?
Yeah, so probably the most, the thing to preempt this with is that for comparison, we compared what happened in 2022 to what happened in 2019. And the reason for going back that far is 2020 as the first pandemic year was an anomaly. And 2021 was a bounce back year after the pandemic year. So 2020 was artificially low, 2021 was artificially high. So we didn't want to compare 2022 to either of those 2 years. So our report compares 2022 to 2019. And given that, I suppose the headline stat is there was an increase of around about 50% in available agent commissions. So that's driven by a couple of things. The average price of properties that were inquired about increased by 30% between 2019 and 2022. And the volume of inquiries increased by 16%. So when you add those two together, you get a net increase of around about 50% of what we call GMV, gross market volume. But it has a direct influence on the amount of money that agents can make in commission.
Okay, so we're saying that comparing it to pre-pandemic, then whilst the inquiries were actually up, so that could have been an element of leftover pent-up demand, or it might have been an element of people changing their priorities and sort of being in a bit more hurry to have a better life. Maybe even the remote working element. So that could account for the 16% against 2019. Would it be fair to say then that the big takeaway from those two, more so maybe even, is that the average value of the leads has actually gone up by a substantial amount? So people are spending more money.
Yeah, that was the biggest surprise to me, to be honest, especially with the beginning of 2022 marking the invasion of Ukraine. We kind of thought that 2022, the activity might have been suppressed. But actually, it started off really, really strong, very strong Q1, very strong Q2, started tailing down towards the end of the year, I think, as the effects of inflation and interest rates kicked in. And in fact, that's carried on to Q1 this year, 2023. We've seen it suppressed compared to this quarter last year. But yeah, 2022 on its own was incredibly strong, surprisingly strong.
That marries up with what the national stats do tell us, even though, like we said earlier, we're kind of looking at the foreign buyer elements of it. But that a lot of the stats show that last year, in terms of sales across Spain, was a year of, well, I wouldn't say a year of two halves, but a year of 3 quarters and 1 quarter, because the last quarter there was a significant dip back down from what the overall trend was, which was kind of had to happen. Well, what goes up must come down at some point. And it was kind of what everybody sort of predicted. And then coming into the year this year, there is for many agents that I've spoken to, it's been better than they thought. With all the mortgage rate concerns, they thought it might start off as being a very poor quarter one, but on the ground, the thing I'm hearing is that at the first part of the quarter, it did start slow, but it's actually been better than expected. Is that something that the stats that you're seeing so far correlate to?
Yeah. I think because of the timeline involved in most international transactions, the activity we see tends to kind of smooth those big peaks and troughs. But looking at Knight Frank's wealth report for 2023, they came to a pretty similar conclusion that the high net worth individuals are looking at residential property as a safe bet because of what's going on in the stock markets. And because we're kind of past peak inflation and peak interest rates in the UK, at least, the people with discretionary money are beginning to put that money back into residential property. And they mentioned specifically Spain, France, Italy, and Portugal, the resorts, the sunny or the snow resorts, as the place where these people are trying to put their money. And what we're beginning to see is that pull-through effect for the rest of the market, that it's stimulating interest further down as people sell and kind of upgrade.
Okay, so would it be fair to say, for the purpose of context, that when we're looking at the national statistics that come out, they're very historical, because they're either from the notaries or from the land registry, which tends to not include up-to-date stuff to do with new builds and so on. What portal stats do give us, whilst the prices and average values and other sort of things doesn't necessarily mean that there were the sales. What it does do is it gives us an insight into the future rather than a sight into the past. So if you take a typical lead to sale period of between 3 and 5 months, maybe you call it 4 months for the sake of it, then what's happening right now on a portal in terms of search volume, a portal that is worth talking to in terms of their volume and their audience, obviously. But what those stats tell us now is what's likely to turn into sales in a quarter or two's time. So it's highly relevant, isn't it?
It's a look into future transactions. And now you've got to sort of take inquiry volume with a pinch of salt, because we know that not every inquiry will convert to a transaction. But when we calculate GMV, when we try and get a big picture view of market volume, we assume a 1% conversion from inquiry to transaction. We know the price that's been inquired about, so we can make a reasonable stab at what the future transaction value is going to be for agents.
Going back to the report for a second, then, are there any? You look at all the different languages, and you sort of break it away from just the country of origin of that traffic, don't you? You kind of look at it in terms of the combinations between country and language, because there is a large element of traffic that occurs in Spain that are foreign buyers in Spain. Is that correct?
That was one of the biggest surprises, actually. So in terms of headline numbers, if you look at buyers from the United Kingdom, let me check my numbers here. The volume of inquiries between 2019 and 2022 is actually down by 17%. So 2022, 17% lower than 2019. But when you look at the volume of transactions from English language inquiries, it's up massively. And where it's up massively is where English language buyers are inquiring from within Spain. That's up 80% compared to 2019. That was a huge surprise. The hypothesis we're coming up with is that the people who are motivated, the English-speaking buyers who are motivated to buy back in 2019, have since moved to Spain, either temporarily or they've made a first purchase, just to deal with the Brexit nonsense. But yeah, in terms of country, location of international buyers, Spain is number one for inquiries to Spanish properties.
But not in Spanish.
But not in Spanish. Over 50% of inquiries originating within Spain are in English.
Okay, so that tells us that there are basically there might not be English, but they are English-speaking buyers that are here for whatever reason. They're inquiring here on the ground.
They're English-speaking, and they're not using the domestic portals. Well, just on that bit, another surprising cohort within that group are Spanish-speaking buyers in Spain who are using Quiero to make inquiries. And we're working on an assumption here, and we need to do more digging, but we think those are people from Latin America whose native language is Spanish, so they inquire in Spanish, but they're searching like an international buyer. So therefore, they're not using the Idealista and Fotocasa.
So what about the other main markets that you would typically associate with buyers in Spain, whether it be, Germany, France?
Two big surprises there actually is the increase in German-speaking buyers, mostly in Germany. So German language originating from Germany. Checking numbers here, they're up 114% compared to 2019. So a big increase in German buyers. And if you look at Netherlands and Belgium together, they're up around about 50% between them. So a lot more interest from those areas. The biggest surprise to me is if you add up the Dutch-speaking buyers from Belgium and the Netherlands, there's slightly more of them than German buyers.
Wow. Okay. That sort of makes sense from what we see in at least some of the resort areas on the ground, where the Dutch and Belgian Dutch speakers tend to be a larger percentage of foreign buyers than the Germans. Obviously, they have Mallorca for the Germans. That's where they hang out.
Yeah, of the two groups that reduced between 2019 to 2022, UK was one, Sweden was the other. So Sweden was down, UK was down 17%, Sweden was down 21%. Now, it's a bigger percentage of a smaller number. So in terms of overall impact on the market, I think that impact is much less than the impact of the reduction of UK buyers. But yeah, we've, because of what's been going on in Sweden, I think they've got their own economic problems to deal with. The only exception there are Swedish-speaking buyers in Spain. Yeah, they're up 23% compared to 2019.
Okay, so that keeps on reinforcing the point that there are a lot of international buyers that are in Spain searching for Spanish property.
Yeah, and of course, these people are, for want of a better term, hot leads. They don't have to travel to make a viewing. They kind of understand something about the market. They're just not as fluent in searching for a property on a domestic portal as a Spanish national.
I know you don't have a crystal ball, but how are we feeling about the quarter or two ahead? What are the stats telling us?
I think we'll be lucky to match 2022 in terms of overall performance, but I think we'll end up there or thereabouts. Actually, if you look back at the inquiry volume, 2020 was pretty similar to 2019. It didn't crash. And we see that from obviously our own business. Even though it was a serious pandemic year, it wasn't the absolute car crash that we thought it might be. 2021 was a big pickup. 2022 was strong. I think we're probably going to see 2023 tailing off a bit, but I think we'll see it get stronger as the year progresses due to the sort of the end of the big interest rates, hopefully the end of the energy pricing scares. So it's different. I mean, one thing we do learn from all of this data is that we call it the international buyer market. We can slice and dice it so many ways. It's such a long tail. So we've had to limit some of our reports to the top 50 language and country combinations because it goes on for hundreds and hundreds of combinations of buyers. And in each one of those cases, there's a macroeconomic driver that affects their behavior. So just for 2022, we saw inquiries from just under 200 countries. We only deal with 13 languages, call it 12. So if you multiply 200 by 12, you get, 2,500 combinations. So in effect, that's 2,500 micro markets inside this sort of mix. But the big ones are English speaking, wherever they're located, French, Dutch, and German speaking. Some Spanish, actually, I'm surprised about how big the sort of the Latin American cohort is becoming. So I think for an agent, if you can cover those 5 languages and you're promoting your properties in the locations where those people are, that's the tricky thing. So I don't want to bash Rightmove, but when an agent advertises on Rightmove, they're getting English-speaking buyers in England. Well, we know from our data that there's a whole bunch more in Spain. So, and they're not on Idealista. So you have to be really careful about how to target those buyers. And it's not just language or country, it's language and country.
That's the takeaway, isn't it? It's language and country.
Yeah.
Well, Martin, thank you so much for giving us that little lowdown and insight into the market report. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for anybody that's interested, the report that's available is a 2-page summary of a 30-page report, which is also a summary. There's an email on the 2-page report. Just drop us an email. We'll send you the full report.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Alfredo.